So far in this class, we've talked about things like scarcity and opportunity cost, supply and demand, and the way that market prices come from supply and demand, and other things like that that are not created by human beings, but are just sort of laws of reality. They're things that are just out there. From now on in the class, we're going to be talking about how humans organize themselves around those realities, how humans organize themselves for production, business, commerce, and we're going to start today with business organizations. Today I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of structures that people can use when they want to go into business, and you're probably familiar with all of them in some way, but what you're probably not as familiar with are the trade-offs and the reasons why you would go into one as opposed to the other. So there are going to be 7 things that I'm going to talk about that can determine whether or not you want to be a partnership or a corporation or a sole proprietor. One of the most obvious factors is control. With some business types you have more control, and with others you have less. Another factor is the share of the profits that the owner or owners can take home. Some business types are easier to start up than others, and that's another factor that people take into consideration when they're deciding what kind of business to start. A fourth very important consideration is the level of taxes and regulations that you're going to face because of the kind of business that you start. Another important consideration is how big you want your business to grow. Some business organization types are much more growth limited than others. The kind of business you want to start is also going to depend on the managerial skill set that you bring with you. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit about more when I talk about the individual types of business organization. A 7th and very important consideration is your access to investment funds, or your ability to fundraise for your business. The 8th and possibly the most important consideration that I'm going to talk about is liability. I'm going to talk about this a little bit longer because it's confusing and you guys know it as something else. Liability is the legally bound obligation to pay debts. That's how your book puts it. You guys know liability in the sense of, can someone sue you if there's something dangerous or somebody has some kind of accident? And that's not what we're talking about here at all. What we're talking about is most businesses in the course of operation, no matter what kind of business organization they are, will take on debts at some point during their lifetime, and a lot of them usually have some kind of debt. And the question is, who is responsible to pay those debts if the business goes under, or if there's a bankruptcy, who's responsible for paying back as much of the debt as you can? And that's a very, very important issue. You want to minimize your liability so that there's less risk that you'll lose your house or lose some kind of collateral that you put up. Before I go into the particulars of what each business organization is, I want you to remember and hold in your mind that what I'm talking about with each of these business organizations is the benefits and drawbacks in terms of these 8 previous considerations that I've just talked about. The first business organization I'm going to talk about is a sole proprietorship, and this is relatively straightforward. A sole proprietor is a sole owner of a business. The advantages of a sole proprietorship are relatively obvious. You get to make 100% of the decisions. What you say goes. You take home 100% of the profits. This kind of business is fairly easy to start up. You don't need much special paperwork. You can just go down to City Hall or whatever local government you're under and get a business license. And there are not a lot of taxes or regulations that sole proprietorships are specially subject to. Of course, you're subject to any of the normal taxes or regulations. So if you start a restaurant, you still have to follow the health code. But yeah, there's not much regulation specifically having to do with this business type. The drawbacks to a sole proprietorship, though, can also be pretty significant. So the first thing, and maybe the most obvious thing, is that even though you get to make 100% of the decisions, you also are the only manager. So you have to be a good manager. You have to be good at hiring people. You have to be an accountant. You have to be a business planner. And usually that's a lot for one person to handle. Another limitation is that there are limited access to funds for a sole proprietor. Usually sole proprietors are just drawing from their life savings. They don't have the option of raising money in some of the ways that corporations or partnerships can do. And because they have limited access to investment money, they also tend to be relatively size limited. Now, sole proprietorships can become as big as any corporation can become, but they tend not to for that reason. And the final consideration is probably the most important one, which is that as a sole proprietor, you have 100% of the liability. A lot of times if you have business loans and your business goes bankrupt, you could lose everything, not just the money you invested, but also any collateral you put up for your loan. So a lot of times things like your house, and that's a really big drawback. The next type of business organization that I'm going to talk about is a partnership, and partnerships are just what they sound like. It's two or more people going into business together. Partnerships tend to occupy sort of a middle ground in between sole proprietorships and corporations when it comes to the various advantages and disadvantages, so I'm going to skip most of that, but there are some special advantages and special disadvantages that you face as a partner in a partnership. One of the unique advantages a partnership enjoys is that unlike in a sole proprietorship, each individual partner doesn't have to have all of the business management skills that a sole proprietor does. One person can be sort of the visionary with the business plan, and another person can be in charge of hiring, and another person can be in charge of managing employees, and that's nice to have that kind of support. But the big disadvantage that you don't face in a sole proprietorship or in a corporation is that there is a very significant potential for driving apart friendships or previous relationships because of the conflict that you experience in a partnership. The last type of business organization that I'm going to talk about is a corporation. And a corporation is very different from a partnership or a sole proprietorship because a sole proprietorship is basically equivalent to the person. And a partnership is equivalent to all of the people in the partnership. A corporation is equivalent to a bunch of pieces of paper called stock. And the ownership can switch hands a lot of times because the ownership is determined by who owns those stocks. So that's why your book calls a corporation an entity, a legal entity owned by individual shareholders. Corporations enjoy a lot of really significant advantages, which is why a lot of the biggest companies in the world are corporations and not the other business types. Even though the other business types can technically become that big, it just tends not to happen as often. One of the biggest advantages is liability. Individual shareholders are not liable for the company's debts, which means that if the company goes bankrupt, your shares might become worthless, but that's the worst that's going to happen to you. You're not going to lose your house the way a sole proprietor or a partner might if their business went under. Another big advantage is that, unlike in partnerships or sole proprietorships, corporations can fundraise by selling stocks and bonds, which I'm going to talk about later, which means they have much greater access to investment capital, which in turn means that they can become much larger than the other kinds of businesses. Again, any kind of business can grow to be any size, but if it's really important to you to create a business that's going to become very large, corporations are probably the best way to go. And the final advantage is that the shareholders don't really have to have any management experience or expertise at all because they typically turn it over to a board of directors who hires corporate officers to run the day-to-day operations of the business. So you can own shares in a business but not have any business background at all. And that's really nice too. There are drawbacks to corporations, though, one of which is that each individual share confers only a small portion of the profits, unlike a sole proprietorship where you get to take home 100% if you're the sole proprietor. Another issue is that each individual share only confers a small portion of the decision-making power, not only because there tend to be a lot of shares, a lot of shareholders, but because usually with a corporation, the shareholders delegate the responsibility for running the business to a board of directors who then chooses corporate officers like the CEO or the chief operating officer or the chief financial officer. Another issue is that startup is usually a very lengthy, expensive process requiring a lawyer because the paperwork takes a long time to draw up and is sort of legally complicated. And another big drawback is that the regulations faced by corporations, specifically because they're corporations, tend to be fairly extensive and more difficult to comply with. And a big misconception, too, is that of the types of business organization, corporations face the highest taxes because they're taxed twice. A sole proprietor usually will only have to pay income tax on his earnings because it counts as income for him. For a corporation, they have to pay a corporate income tax on their profits, and then when they want to distribute those profits to their shareholders in the form of dividends, they have to pay taxes again on the dividends. So they face double taxation. A lot of people think corporations are lightly taxed. That's not true. There are very high taxes on corporations, which is probably why they spend so much effort trying to find loopholes. What I want to stress here ultimately is that there's no business organization or business type that is superior to the other ones in general. Each one is suited to a different kind of thing, and that's why a lot of restaurants are sole proprietorships. A lot of doctors' offices are partnerships, and a lot of manufacturing companies are corporations. None is better than any other, except in those individual categories, and that's what you're really responsible for knowing. What are those trade-offs? In various situations, would you rather start a corporation or a sole proprietorship or a partnership? And that's what I want you to think about here.